They hung me on a Tuesday, and I have never in all my long years met a man who could tell me what day of the week he was supposed to die on, so I count myself peculiar in that. The rope was already over the limb when they brought me to the cottonwood, my hands wired behind me, my horse gone, my name gone, and 11 men sitting their saddles in the cold who had decided among themselves what I was without one of them ever having asked me a question. The sky was the color of a dead fire. I remember thinking I would have liked one more cup of coffee, and that it was a small and a foolish thing to think, and that a man's last thought ought to be larger than coffee. Mine wasn't. I was Eli Crandall, and I had been somebody's son and somebody's husband and a man with 800 head of good cattle and a deed to graze them on, and by that Tuesday I was none of those things. Harlan Squires had seen to that. He had my herd in his own valley by then, wearing his iron over my brand, and he had a paper with my name forged at the bottom of it, saying I'd sold him the lot for a price no sane man would take. And when I rode into Sorrel Bend to call him a thief in front of the territory, he had me taken in the dark and called a horse thief and a killer instead. A dead man can't dispute a forged paper. That was the whole of his arithmetic, and it was good arithmetic, and it nearly worked. The man on the lead horse was Del Prout, Squires's foreman, a long, yellow-toothed fellow who smiled the entire time the way some men can't help doing when they are about a low piece of work. He set my horse, their horse, a borrowed nag, under the limb and looped the rope and snugged it, and he leaned down close so the others couldn't hear, and he said, "Mr. Squires says he's sorry it come to this." He smiled wider. He ain't, but he says it. I did not give him the satisfaction of an answer. I had decided that much. If a man can decide nothing else at the end, he can decide to keep his mouth shut, and I have found in the years since that this is a thing worth knowing before you need it. They had picked the cottonwood by Addie Voss's gate on purpose. I learned that later. They picked it because it was a mile off the Sorrel Bend road where nobody decent went after dark, and because the Voss woman was the kind of body nobody in that country reckoned would dare a thing. A spinster keeping a poorhouse for broke-down travelers. A woman they used when they had a dying drifter to be rid of and ignored every other day of the year. Prout figured she'd find me in the morning, cold, and that she'd be too frightened to say a word about who'd done it, and that even if she said the word it would be her word against 11, and her word against 11 was no word at all. He was right about the arithmetic again. He was wrong about the woman, but I'll get to that, because it is the only part of this story that ever mattered, and the rest I tell you only so you'll understand what it cost her and what she was. Prout slapped the nag and it jumped, and I went off the back of it and the rope took me. I want to tell you it was quick, because that is what people want to hear, but a hanging done by amateurs in a hurry is not a quick thing, and I have no use anymore for the soft version of any true thing. The knot slid wrong. It caught me under the jaw instead of behind the ear, and instead of breaking my neck clean it only choked me, and I hung there in the dark turning slow on the rope with my boots 6 inches off the dirt, fighting for air that wouldn't come, watching the 11 of them ride off easy as men leaving a barn dance. The cold came up out of the ground. The light went out of the dead fire sky. I heard the river. And then I didn't hear anything, and I went down into a black place that I figured for the last place, and I made my peace with it the way you do, which is to say, I did not make my peace at all. I only ran out of strength to be afraid. What brought me back was a woman's voice swearing, which is not the angels I'd been half expecting, and the swearing was practical and low, the way you'd swear at a wagon mired to the axle, and it was getting closer. She had heard the horses, that was the thing. She kept the halfway house alone on that hard stretch, and a woman alone learns the sound of a lot of riders where there ought to be none. And she had blown out her lamp and watched from her window and counted them and seen what they were about. And the second the last of them was off down the road she had come out with a lantern and a butcher knife held by the blade, so the handle wouldn't catch the light. And she had cut the gelding loose from her own corral and ridden it bareback the 1/4 mile to the cottonwood in her nightdress and a man's coat, and she could not reach me to hold me up, so she did the only thing left. which was to climb the leaning trunk in the dark with the knife in her teeth, and saw at the rope above the limb until it parted. I came down all at once and landed on her, and the two of us went into the frozen mud together, and she had me, and she got the loop off my throat, and the first whole breath I drew in this world after I had finished with it sounded, she told me later, like a barn door on a dry hinge, and she said it was the worst and the best sound she ever heard a living thing make. I could not see her. I could not talk and would not be able to for the better part of a week, my throat being what it was. But I felt her get her shoulder under my arm, and I felt her swearing at me to stand, to use my legs, to be of some use to her since she could not haul 200 pounds of dead-weight ungrateful man up off the ground by herself, and there was nothing in her voice that was tender. I want to be honest about that. The first sound of love I ever had from Adeline Voss was her cussing me for being heavy. The tenderness she kept somewhere further in, behind a door she'd had to learn to keep shut, and she did not open that door for a man because he was nearly dead. She opened it later, slow, when she decided I'd earned the key. That was her whole way, and I came to understand that a woman who has been used and overlooked her entire life does not give her softness cheap, and that the giving of it, when it comes, is worth 100 women's easy kindness. She got me to the house. I don't know how. She was not a large woman and she was not a young one, near as I could tell, somewhere in her 30s with her brown hair down, and a face the lamp made plain and tired and sharp all at once. And she got me across her own threshold and onto the floor by her stove, and she did not call for help because there was no help to call. And she did not weep over me because weeping does not warm a froze man, and she went to work. That was the first night. I have skipped ahead of myself, because a man telling the most important thing he knows tends to want to get it all out at once, but you ought to understand first who she was before this, in the daylight, so the cutting of that rope means to you what it means to me. Sorrel Bend was a dust town of maybe 200 souls strung along a creek that ran 9 months of the year, with a single street, a store kept by a thin, nervous man named Amos Tilley, a saloon, a church with no regular preacher, and a sheriff named Coyle who wore the badge but answered to whoever's cattle paid the most beef tax, which by then was Harlan Squire's. 2 days wagon haul out of town, on the Quill River Road, where the high plains went on so far and so flat that a homestead out there was less a place than a rumor of one, sat the halfway house. It was not much. A long, low, sodden timber house with a stove at one end, and a row of bunks at the other, and a lean-to barn, and a good deep well, which on those plains was the only true wealth there was. Adeline Voss had built it up out of the homestead her father had filed and died on, and she had taken in, over the years, every broke-down thing the frontier spat west to die. Stove-up freighters, fever cases off the wagon roads, an old buffalo hunter gone simple, women the trail had broken, and men the territory had used up. She fed them on next to nothing, and doctored them with what she could, and buried the ones she couldn't save in a little fenced patch up the rise, and the county had once or twice voted her a few dollars to keep doing it because it was cheaper than doing it themselves, and then forgot to pay her, year on year, the way you forget a thing you'd rather not think about. They called her plain. They called her the old maid out on the quill, and worse than that behind their hands, because there is no creature a hard, mean little town despises like a woman who does the work the town is too cowardly to do, and asks the town for nothing and judges it quietly by being better than it. She had been asked for once, years before, by a man who turned out to want the well and not the woman, and when she'd seen that clear she had told him no, and the town had decided from that day that she'd refuse the only offer she'd ever get and was bitter on it, and that was the story they told. The truth was she'd refused him because she would not be wanted for her water, and a woman who'd rather be alone than be used for her water is not bitter. She's something the opposite of bitter, but Sorrel Bend had no word for it and didn't go looking for one. I learned all this slow, over that winter, in the hours she'd sit by the stove mending or skinning a rabbit, and I'd lie in the bunk too weak to do anything but watch her and learn her. And it was the best schooling I ever had. She had a child out there too. I have to tell you about the child. There was a little girl, 6 or near it, that Addie had taken off a wagon train that came through 2 summers gone, the whole family down with the bloody flux, the parents dead in a day. The train so scared of the sickness they'd have left the orphan on the road if Addie hadn't ridden out and taken her up. The girl was called Sari. She didn't talk. Whatever she'd watched happen on that wagon had stolen her words, and the doctors that passed through said she was simple, and one said she ought to go to the territorial home, and Addie had run him off her property with a hoe. Sari was not simple. Sari was a watchful, careful, perfectly understanding little person who had decided the world was not safe to speak to yet, and Addie had never once tried to make her, and the two of them had a whole language of looks and touches between them, and it was the only thing that softened Addie's face the way nothing else did, and the first time I saw it do that I understood there was a great deal more to her than the cussing. So that was the woman who cut me down. Not a soft woman, not a frightened one. A woman with nothing, keeping a house for nothing, loved by no one but a child who couldn't say so, who had every reason the world ever hands a person to keep her lamp blown out that night and her door barred, and let 11 armed men do their work and find a body in the morning and say nothing. And instead she put a knife in her teeth and climbed a tree. I have spent my whole life since trying to understand why, and I think the answer is the plainest one, which is that she was simply a person who could not stand by, and that there are not many such people, and that the having of even one of them in a country is the difference between a country and a wilderness. The frontier had a great deal of wilderness in it. It had one Addie Voss that I knew of. I do not remember much of the first 2 weeks but fever and her hands. My throat had swelled near shut, and the cold had got into my lungs, and there was a stretch I'd as soon not describe where I think the both of us believed I was going after all. She did not sleep. I have a memory, fever-colored and maybe not all true, of waking in the black of one of those nights, and finding her sitting on the floor beside my bunk with Sari asleep against her and her own head fallen back against the logs, and her hand in mine, not holding it tender but checking it, her 2 fingers on the inside of my wrist counting whether I was still in there, and her counting in her sleep, her lips moving, and me lying there counting along with her to let her know I was, though I couldn't make a sound to tell her. When the fever broke I was a cold, weak skeleton of a man who couldn't sit up without help, and the first clear thing I said to her, in a whisper that cost me everything I had, was, "Who?" She knew what I meant. "I don't know their names," she said, "but I'd know the smiling one again, and I cut a piece off the rope and kept it. There's a man's name burned in the hemp where it was hung off a wagon hook once. Squires. That mean anything." It meant everything. It meant she had not just saved my life that night, she had, without knowing it, picked up the one thread that could unravel Harlan Squires, and she had kept it cool in a tin on a shelf for 2 weeks while she nursed a stranger, on the chance it might someday matter to him. That was Addie. She thought ahead. She saved string. I told her then in pieces over days, since I couldn't talk for long. I told her about the 800 head, and the forged paper and the dead man Squires had pinned on me, a drifter found shot that I'd never laid eyes on, and the deed to the Crandall graze on the bigwater that Squires wanted because his own range was overgrazed to dust, and mine had the only year-round water for 40 miles. I told her I'd had 11 men of my own once, good men, a ramrod named Tomas Reyes who'd ridden for me 8 years and would walk through fire, and that when Squires's lie took hold they'd scattered, some run off, some warned off, 1 or 2 I feared bought off, and that I had no notion where a one of them was now, nor whether they thought me the killer the territory said I was. She listened to all of it with that sharp, tired face, mending or skinning, never stopping her hands, and when I was done she was quiet a while and then she said, "So you're either an innocent man they tried to murder, or a liar I should have left in the tree." She set down her work and looked at me dead level. "Which is it?" "Innocent," I said. "It came out cracked." "I figured," she said, and picked her work back up. "Liars are smoother. You're a terrible talker." And that was the closest thing to a verdict of trust I'd had from a soul in months, and I have never in my life been so glad to be called a terrible talker. But the winter on the quill was a cruelty all its own, and I want you to understand that it was not gentle out there even between the men with ropes. The wind came off 1,000 miles of open grass with nothing to break it, and the snow when it came sideways, and the cold was the kind that killed cattle standing and froze the water in the bucket 2 feet from the stove. The halfway house lived close to the edge in the best of years, and that year was not the best of years. Addie had laid in for one mouth and a child's, and now she had 2 grown mouths, and one of them, mine, needed feeding up like a sick steer. She never said a word about it, but I am a stockman and I can read a hayloft, and I watched the cellar and the meat and the cornmeal go down faster than the calendar said they should, and I knew what it meant. And the day I could stand and hold a thing without falling over, I went out to her woodpile, against her telling me not to, and I split wood for 2 hours and could not lift the axe higher than my knee by the end of it and had to lean on the chopping block and breathe. And she came out and found me there with my hands bleeding from the blisters a soft man gets, and she did not coddle me. She said, "You'll pull every stitch in that throat out doing that." And then she stood there a second and she said lower, "But it's a tidy pile," and she went back in, and I sat down on the woodpile a beaten and a happy man, because I had managed to be of 1 hour's use to the woman who had given me my life, and that hour was the first brick in a wall I have spent decades building, and it has never been high enough. That is the thing about a debt like the one I owed her. It does not get smaller as you pay it. You learn the size of it slow, the way I learned her, and the more of her I came to know the bigger the debt grew, because I came to see that what she'd given me on that Tuesday was not just the air in my lungs but every day that came after, and you cannot put a hurt against a sum like that, though God knows I tried. We worked, that winter, into a way of being. I was no good for the heavy labor for a long while, but I could mend harness sitting down, and I could doctor stock, and I could sit with Sari. The child took to me, which surprised the both of us. She would bring me her one toy, a carved horse a freighter had whittled her, and stand it on my knee and walk it up my arm, and I would talk to it low, not to her, never directly, Addie having taught me without a word that you do not corner that child. You leave the door open and let her come, and one evening, a long time in, the horse walked up my arm and Sari, watching it, made a small sound, the little wicker a child makes for a horse, and then clapped her own hand over her own mouth, frightened of her own voice, and looked at Addie. And Addie, by the stove, did not make a fuss, which would have been the wrong thing and would have shut that child up for another year. She just said easy, not even looking up, "That's a good horse," and went on with her mending. And Sari took her hand down off her mouth slow and wickered again, on purpose this time, and the 2 grown people in that room did not look at each other for fear of breaking it. And I have been in some grand places since, and some happy ones, and I am not sure I was ever happier than in that low sod house with a froze wind outside, and a child learning she was allowed to make a sound. That was Addie's whole gift, you see. She made a place where the broke-down things were safe to mend at their own pace. She'd done it for that child for 2 years. She did it for me without ever calling it that. And I, who had come there a dead man, found my voice and my legs and something I'd thought squires had killed for good, which was the belief that the world might still come out decent if a body worked at it. She gave me that back. I didn't know yet how I'd ever pay it. But the town came out finally. They always do. It was Coyle, the sheriff, and Amos Tilley, the storekeeper, and a banker out of the county seat named Pruitt, who I did not yet know was the worst of the 3, because he was the only one of them who never had to raise his voice. They came in March, in a buggy, picking their way out the Quill Road, and they sat in Addie's good chairs and drank her coffee, and Pruitt laid it out. The homestead was hers free, her father having proved it up, but the halfway house and the relief work, that was a different paper. Years back, when the county first asked her to keep the poorhouse, Addie's father had taken a small loan against the place to build the bunkroom and the barn and dig the deep well, on the county's promise to pay it back out of the relief money. The county had stopped paying the relief money. The loan had not stopped being a loan. Pruett's bank held it now, having bought the paper cheap, and the loan was called. And the sum was more money than Addie Voss had seen in 5 years of work. And she had 30 days, and Pruett was very sorry, and he said so the way Pruett had said Squires was sorry. I sat in the corner with my hat down, a stranger nobody'd named, and I watched Harlan Squires's hand in it as plain as if he'd signed the buggy. Squires wanted that deep well same as he wanted my big water grays, for the same reason. Water was the only thing on those plains worth killing for, and a man building an empire of dry, overgrazed range needed every drop of it he could thieve under cover of law. He couldn't take Addie's homestead, that was hers clean, but he could take the halfway house out from under her through Pruett's bank, fold the well into his holdings, and turn the one decent place on the Quill into another of his line camps, and Addie out onto her 160 dry acres to starve genteel. It was the same play he'd run on me, only slower and with paper instead of rope, which is the more respectable way and kills you just the same. When they'd gone, Addie sat a long while at the table looking at Pruett's figures, and Sari climbed up in her lap, and Addie held her, and her face was the face of a woman doing arithmetic that won't come out no matter how you work it. And I came and sat down across from her, and I said the only thing I had, which was the truth. I said I had 800 head and a deed and 11 men. Squires has the head and the deed. But a brand's a brand, and a forged bill of sale is a forged bill of sale, and there's men still alive who can swear to my mark and my hand, and there's a piece of rope on your shelf with his name burned in it, and there's me, who he is going to be very surprised to learn is breathing. Addie, I came here a dead man with nothing to give you. I am not a dead man anymore. Give me the spring. Let me ride out and find my ramrod and clear my name and take back what's mine, and I will see this place paid free and this town learn what you are, if it is the last thing I do in this life, which it may be. She looked at me a long time, and here is the thing I love her for past all the rest, more even than the rope. She did not melt, and she did not say a man would save her, and she did not hand me her trouble like a woman glad to be rid of it. She narrowed her eyes at me the way she'd narrow them at a horse trader, and she said, "Or you ride out and keep riding, and I never see you again, and I've wintered a stranger for nothing." "That could be how it goes," I said. "From where you sit, you've no cause to think different. You don't know me." "Oh," she said, "I don't." And then she did something I have turned over in my mind 10,000 nights since. She got up and she went to the shelf, and she took down the tin with the piece of rope in it, and she came back and she set it in front of me, Squires's name burned in the hemp, the one thing in the world that could hang him or clear me. She put it in my hands. She gave a stranger the only weapon she had, on no more surety than a winter's worth of watching him split wood and talk to a horse. "That's not because I trust you," she said, and her voice was rough. "That's because if I keep it on my shelf it's worth nothing, and if you are what you say, it's worth everything, and a thing that might be worth everything has no business sitting in a tin doing nothing. That's all that is." She sat back down. "Don't make it more than it is." I have never in my life been handed anything that was more than it was. I rode out in the first week the road would bear a horse, on the gelding she'd cut me down with a little food she could ill spare and the tin in my coat against my heart, and I will not lay out all the long going of it because the story is hers and not the territory's. But I will tell you the shape of it, because she earned the knowing of how it came out. I found Tomas Reyes in a railhead town 140 miles southeast, mucking stalls for his keep, having been run off the Bigwater at gunpoint and warned that the boss was hung, and the brand was Squires's now, and any man who said otherwise would join the boss in the ground. He was mucking those stalls, I learned, only long enough to earn a horse and a gun, because he had never for one day believed I'd done what they said, and he was fixing to ride back and find out the truth or die finding out. And when he saw me alive in that stable doorway, He sat down in the straw and put his face in his hands and was not ashamed to weep, and neither was I. And we are old men now, and we have never once spoken of it because some things you keep behind a door same as Addie kept her softness. Tomas knew where the others were. Where Squires had scattered 11 good men, the 11 had drifted back toward one another the way good men do, working here and there within a few days' ride, waiting on something they couldn't have named. We gathered them in 3 weeks, old Pete Hanley, the 2 Breivik boys, a Tonkawa tracker named Joaquin, who was the finest horseman I ever knew and who Squires's crowd had sneered at as a half-breed, and who proved worth any 3 of them, and the rest. And we did not go in shooting, because I had learned something on the quill that winter about the long, slow, respectable kind of killing and how you answer it. You answer it with paper of your own, and with witnesses, and with the law, even crooked law, made to stand up straight in front of enough eyes that it can't sit back down. We rode for the territorial seat, not for Sorrel Bend. We found the brand inspector, an honest old article named Halsey who'd recorded my mark years before and who took one look at Squires's bill of sale and the price on it and snorted, because no living cattleman sells 800 head for that, and it told its own lie. We found the storekeeper at the Bigwater who'd witnessed the real Crandall hand and would swear my signature against the forged one. We found, hardest of all and best of all, the drifter Squires had said I'd shot alive. It turned out, very much alive, having been paid by Prout to disappear and play dead and gone to ground in a mining camp, and run to ground now by Joaquin, who could track a shadow across rock, and turned by the promise that Squires would hang for the murder of a man who was standing right there breathing, which is a thing that frightens a paid liar more than any threat, the prospect of being the corpse in his own frame-up. And we had the rope, Addie's rope, the hangman's hemp with Squires's name burned in it where it had hung from a wagon hook in his own barn, and Prout's smiling face for 11 men to remember once the wind shifted, and the wind always shifts when the man you feared starts to lose. It took the better part of 2 months. I will not pretend it was clean or sure, or that there weren't nights I lay out under those stars certain it would all come apart, and certain, too, that Addie's 30 days had long run out, and the bank had taken the halfway house and her with it, and that I'd come back, if I came back, to a Squire's line camp on her well and her gone onto her dry acres, and not a thing I could do would give her back the place she'd built. That fear rode with me harder than Squires's men ever did. I had cleared my name halfway across the territory, and the only ledger I cared about was the one out on the quill. It was full spring when we came back. The grass had come on green and the wind had gone soft, and the road that had nearly killed me ran easy. And we did not ride to Sorrel Bend first, though Squires was already broke by then, the inspector's word and the live dead. Man and the rope had done in a week what no gun could, and Coyle had read the wind and turned, the way weak men do at the last, and there were warrants out, and Squires was sitting in the county jail trying to buy a lawyer with money that was about to stop being his, and the 800 head, my 800 head, were under territorial hold pending the sorting out. And the Bigwater deed was mine again with the ink barely dry, and I was, on paper, a cattleman once more and a cleared man and richer than I'd been before they hung me, because a court that has been embarrassed is generous with damages. None of that is what I rode for. I rode for the quill. We came up the road 11 riders and a herd of saddle stock and 2 wagons, and I was out front, and a long way off I could see the halfway house still standing, thank God, the bank's 30 days notwithstanding, and I learned later that Pruett had been arrested alongside Squires for the paper they'd run together, and that a court with its blood up had voided the called loan as part of a fraud, so the place was Addie's free and clear, and had been for a month. Though she'd had no way to know whether I was alive to have done any of it. She had defended that house alone for that whole month not knowing. She had a shotgun by the door and a child behind her, and she had run off 2 of Squires's men herself before the warrants came, an overlooked plain spinster on a dry road holding what was hers against the territory, And if you ever doubt what she was, hold that picture, because it is the truest one I own. She was out front of the house when we came up. She had heard the riders, she always heard the riders, and she'd come out with the shotgun, and Sari behind her in the door, and she stood there small and squared off in her apron facing down 11 mounted men and a dust cloud, ready. The way she'd been ready the night she climbed the tree, because being ready alone was the only way she'd ever lived. And then she knew me. I saw it cross her face from 100 yards, the gelding maybe before the man, and she did not drop the shotgun and run out and weep on my neck, because that was never going to be her, and I'd have been disappointed if it had been. She lowered the barrel slow, and she set the butt of it on the ground and leaned on it, and she watched the whole outfit come up into her yard, 11 riders and saddle stock and the wagons, Loyalty and Fortune both, riding up the Quill Road to the one door on those plains that had opened to a dead man. And she watched her dry, overlooked, forgotten yard fill up with all of it, more men and horses than had been on that place in 20 years, and her face did a thing I had only seen it do for the child. I got down off the gelding in front of her. 11 men took off their hats, Tomas first, then all of them, because I had told them on the ride what she was and what she'd done, and a story like that travels through good men fast and makes them better. They took off their hats to the plain spinster of the Quill the way they'd have done for a queen, which she was worth more than, and she stood there leaning on her shotgun in her apron and looked at all those bared heads and did not know what to do with it, having never in her life had a hat taken off to her by one man, let alone 11. I said, I told you I'd see this place paid free, and a court did it before I could, so I'm cheated of that, and I told you the town would learn what you are. I nodded back down the road toward Sorrel Bend. It's learning. Squires is in a cell, so's Pruett. Coyle won't have his badge by summer. The whole story's out, the rope, the tree, the woman that cut a man down when 11 armed men rode off and left him. They're telling it in the saloon, Addie. They're telling it like it's about somebody. It's about you. She didn't say anything. Her jaw was working. And I told you, I said, and my own voice was not steady, that I came here a dead man with nothing to give you. That part's not true anymore either. I've got my herd and my grays and more money than's decent and 11 men who'd ride off the edge of the world for either one of us. I took the tin out of my coat. The rope was still in it. I'd kept it the whole way. I held it out to her. And I've got this back to give you, which is the only thing I own the day you saved my life, and it turned out to be worth everything, exactly like you said. You told me a thing worth everything has no business sitting in a tin doing nothing. I think that is the moment she understood I had not come to repay her and ride on. I think up to then she'd half believed I'd settle the place and tip my hat and go be a rich cleared cattleman somewhere a man like me belonged, and leave her the plain spinster in the story they'd tell. She'd braced for it. A woman braces for the leaving so the leaving can't surprise her. I watched her brace. I'm asking to stay, I said. Not to pay you back, there's no paying that back. I've done the figuring and it won't come out. You've ruined me for arithmetic. I'm asking because I split your wood and sat with your girl and watched you cut a man down off a tree, and I have not had a single hour since that I wanted to spend anywhere but where you are. I'm too plain a talker to say it better. You called me that yourself. But she did not answer me right off. That was Addie. She looked past me at the 11 men and the horses and the wagons and the whole loud fortune of it, and I knew what she was thinking because I'd come to be able to read her the way I read a hayloft. She was thinking that a rich man's offer to a poor woman is a thing to be careful of, that men have wanted her well before they wanted her, that the kindest-looking deal is the one that costs you yourself. She had refused a man once for wanting her water. She was capable of refusing one for wanting her gratitude, and I'd not have blamed her, and I think she knew I'd not have blamed her, and that was part of what decided it. You don't want the well, she said. It wasn't a question, it was the test, the whole of her in 5 words. I've got more water on the big water than I know what to do with, I said. I don't want your well, Addie. I want the woman who'd give a stranger the only thing she owned because it had no business doing nothing in a tin. I was near out of words, and I am not a man with many. I want to keep the halfway house open with you and money behind it for once, so the broke-down things that come west to die get to mend instead. I want to be the third one at that stove. I want Sari to have a man around that talks low to her horse. I don't want a thing of yours. I want to give you everything I've got and call it square, knowing it won't be square, and spend the rest of my life happy that it isn't. And Sari, who had crept out from the doorway during all of this and come and stood against Addie's skirts, looked up at the man she'd taught her voice back to, and she said, out loud, clear, the second sentence I ever heard out of that child, she said, stay. That was what undid her, not me, the child. Addie looked down at Sari, and the door behind Addie's face, the one she kept shut, the one she'd cracked for a child and a wickered horse and never for a grown man, came open, and her sharp, tired, plain deer face crumpled and was, for one moment, simply a young woman's face, and she put her hand over Sari's hair and she looked back up at me, and she said, and her voice was a wreck, all the steel gone out of it, the cussing gone out of it. Just a woman who had been alone her whole life, finding out she didn't have to be, she said. Then stay. Just that. Then stay. I have heard sweeter words said by smoother men, and they meant nothing. Those two from her meant the whole world had decided, after 30-odd years of pretending not to see her, and I was only the lucky fool standing nearest when it did. We were married that June by a circuit preacher under the cottonwood at her gate, the same tree, her idea, not mine, and when I balked at it she said, "It's a good tree, it just had a bad night same as you," which is the kind of thing she'd say, and which is also, now that I am old, about the truest thing anybody ever said about a hard life. It's a good tree. It just had a bad night. We kept the halfway house open the rest of our days, and with the big water behind it, the broke-down things that came west got more than a place to die. A good many of them got a place to live. And worked the stock, and stayed, and our outfit grew strange and patched and loyal, the way a thing grows when it's built out of the rescued. Tomas Reyes married a Sorrel Bend girl whose people had once crossed the street from him and lived to dance at the wedding. Pete Hanley is buried up the rise now, in Addie's little fenced patch, the first of us to go and not the last, and there's a stone there for me waiting with my name on it, the name they tried to erase off the earth one Tuesday, cut deep in granite where no man can forge it. Sari talked after that day, slow at first and then all the time, the way a thing does when the dam breaks, and she runs the halfway house now, an old woman herself, my daughter in every way but the blood, and she keeps her mother's deep well and her mother's open door and her mother's rule, which we none of us ever wrote down but all of us know, that you do not stand by. That when the riders go off and leave a thing to die at your gate, you put a knife in your teeth and you climb the tree. Sorrel Bend learned what she was. They were ashamed of themselves for a while, the way a town is, and then they were proud of her, which is easier, and then they made her a sort of legend, which is easiest of all and the least true, because a legend is a tree without the bad night, and Addie was the whole tree. When she died, and she died old in her bed in the house she built with her hand in mine, and I will not tell you the rest of that because some doors stay shut. The whole town came out the Quill Road for her, 200 souls and the dust of them visible for an hour before they arrived. The same road 11 killers once rode out on in the dark, and they took off their hats. The whole town, every hat. I stood by the stone with her name on it and I thought about the tin. I have it yet. The piece of rope is still in it, Squires's name burned in the hemp, and I am an old man and I take it down some nights and hold it, the only thing I own the day she saved me, and I think about what she told me, that a thing that might be worth everything has no business sitting in a tin doing nothing. She was right, of course. She generally was, so I will not leave it in the tin. I will tell you, you who are hearing this, the whole of it, the tree and the rope and the cussing and the wood and the child and the well, so that it does not sit doing nothing, so that somewhere down whatever road you ride there is a woman or a man froze and condemned at your gate with 11 good reasons riding off and leaving them. And you remember a plain spinster nobody wanted out on the Quill River Road, who had every reason on earth to keep her lamp blown out, and who got up instead, and went out into the cold and cut a stranger down. That stranger was me. I got 50 good years and a wife and a daughter and a yard full of loyal men out of one woman's refusal to stand by. There is no arithmetic for it. I quit trying years ago. I only know that the whole worth of my long life was handed to me by a person the world had decided was worth nothing, and that the world was wrong, the way it so often is about the quiet ones doing the work it won't, and that if I have done one useful thing with the time she gave me back, it is only this: I have taken off my hat, every day of my life, to Adeline Voss, who cut me down.